Stretching before a resistance training session is largely pointless. In fact, it may actually negatively impact your ability to lift weights and contract muscle and things like that, and basically scupper your hypertrophy-based goals. But does that mean stretching is just therefore pointless in general? Or is there situations that we need to think about stretching as a positive thing when we're trying to achieve certain goals? That's what we're going to be talking about on today's episode of the show. If you're watching this on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're listening on a podcast, leave a rating and a review. That would be absolutely awesome. Plus, if you're interested in taking some next steps with your training and your nutrition, then you can check out the links in the show notes below where you'll find free resources, free calorie calculator if you're trying to figure all that stuff out, guides on how to figure out what calories and macros are. You can also have free training programs and a whole host of training and nutrition articles on IamParadiseFitness.com. So go check those out after you've finished listening to this episode of the show. But for now, let's get into this episode all about stretching. So when we think about stretching, particularly in the context of building muscle, there is a growing sort of feeling in the evidence-based community that it's not actually that beneficial. So in terms of like stretching lots before you do a strength training or resistance training session is actually probably going to decrease your performance in those sets. So you probably don't want to do lots of deep stretching for long periods of time before you actually start to lift weight. It's also probably not going to improve your reducing the risk of injury. It's not really going to improve that very much at all. And then the other thing is that you only need to be as flexible as you need to be. Now that's very craply philosophical, but what I mean is you only need to be as flexible as the goal you're trying to achieve dictates. So if you're trying to be an elite level gymnast, you've got to fucking work on your flexibility because it's necessary. If you're someone who is literally your only goal is to just build a bit of muscle, you can do that without being incredibly flexible. It might help to have a little bit more flexibility, but it's not essential. You can still build muscle with limited flexibility. I, for one, am someone who can attest to that. Now, that's not necessarily me bragging to say, well, I'm fucking inflexible as fuck and I build muscle. It's more me saying that I've broken a hip. My hip is full of metal work, and that means that my flexibility, my range in my hips and my pelvis is just really shot to shit. It's not good at all. So that limits me in certain exercises, but it hasn't prevented me from building muscle and building the physique that I want. So flexibility in that sense is you only need to be as flexible as the goal you're trying to achieve dictates. But this can then lead us on to different sort of avenues and rabbit holes of thinking that we live in this black and white world where, okay, well, if that's the case, then I don't need to be flexible, so stretching is shit. Let's never do it. But rarely in anything, especially in fitness, do you get this situation where it's complete black and white, where it's either yes or it's no. Most things sit in a gray area in the middle, and then we have to layer on top of that context. And context comes from things like, what's your situation? What's your goal? What's your starting point? All of these different sorts of things matter. So it's the typical scenario of when a coach or someone like me says, it depends. Now, it depends should be followed by lots of context. So what does it depend on? So when I said that before, that maybe stretching doesn't necessarily add anything, well, the context of that is if your goal is to only build muscle. If, for example, you are a power lifter and you're trying to do competitions where you're deadlifting, you're bench pressing, squatting, and so on, then you are going to have a degree of range of motion to perform those movements. So for example, you have to abide by the rule of the bar touching your chest on a bench press. So therefore, you are going to have to be able to have that range of motion, that flexibility, that mobility within those joints that are performing that movement in order to do that and to do that well. If you haven't got that range of motion right now and you want to be a power lifter, then you're going to have to work on flexibility, mobility in those joints to make that happen. So that's a bit of context for you already. So really, it depends on that goal and where you are in relation to achieving that goal. So if you're already super flexible, then maybe adding lots of flexibility into your routine may be a little bit of a waste of time. Maybe you just need enough to maintain that. If you're trying to get to that goal and you're way away from it, maybe you need to add some flexibility in your routine to actually improve. Whereas if that's nothing to do with where your goal, where you want to be in life, maybe you don't need any flexibility at all. But again, that doesn't mean it's shit. So let's talk range of motion. Now, there's lots of rules around range of motion as they pertain to like external factors. Now, we've already talked about bar touching chest on a bench press. We, talked in previous episodes of the show about astergrass in squats. These are all external things that we think about when it comes to exercise, movement, and range of motion. So in real terms, range of motion applies to an exercise, but it also applies to a human being as well. So for example, a full range of motion for the exercise of a bench press would be bar to chest, because it literally can't go any further down because of the structure of your body. And then you're going to be pressing it out to full extension. That's the full range of motion of that exercise. However, depending on your own body mechanics, thickness of rib cage, thinking about the length of your forearm, thinking of the length of your humerus, things like that, they're structural things that may mean that you don't actually have the range of motion to be able to touch the bar to your chest in your active range of motion. So that's like the difference between a range of motion for an exercise and a range of motion for a person. So you might though want to add some increased range of motion into a particular exercise for yourself so that you could get more out of it. So theoretically, if you could increase a range of motion on your bench press, it wasn't structural or anything like that, that could potentially offer you some benefits in terms of building muscle. So potentially, if that's your goal, you should put some time and effort into trying to increase that. Again, it's going to be dependent on, is your restriction completely structural? And therefore, you can't change fucking bone length unless you're going to get a doctor to separate your fucking forearm from your humerus and then shave a bit off and reattach it. I'd say that's a pretty extreme way to try and increase range of motion. Probably not one I would recommend either. But if this range of motion is not so good, it's not structural that's preventing you, it's literally just some tightness and things like that, maybe some flexibility work over the course of time is going to help improve that. Over the longer term for that's going to improve those particular movements, it's going to improve your ability to build muscle. But if your range of motion is just all like you got to where you structurally can't go any further, or the range of motion is as good as it needs to be for that exercise, again, flexibility probably isn't a worthwhile pursuit in terms of massively putting time and effort into that. Again, it just depends where your goals are. If you want to be like an Olympic level freaking gymnast or be able to do the splits, if that's one of your goals, then obviously that's completely different. That's in a scenario where flexibility is crucially important to achieving your goal. So you're going to need to. Again, comes back to where are you in terms of what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve. Now, there are some studies as well that show improvements in range of motion from stretching. So you can look at various different studies that show, okay, if you stretch various different muscles over the course of time, that can improve the range of motion. Again, proving that if that's something that you want to work on, stretching can help with that particular motion. So I would say in terms of like think about pre-workout stuff, maybe don't focus on flexibility there. Focus on your flexibility in your rest days where you're just recovering. It's a light day. You can focus on doing some nice stretching. You can sit into some particular positions for extended periods of time so you can feel those stretches. You can progress those stretches. Because again, like with anything, progressive overload is a key part of the process. So you can progressively overload in terms of how great a stretch that you put on yourself and things like that, not just about shoving a fuck ton of weight on a bar. So, and again, when you're talking about pre-workout, maybe let's talk about that for a second, is that stretching a lot pre-workout does fuck all. You know, how much extra range you're going to get in a squat because you fucking just did a few stretches? It's going to be fucking nothing. And arguably, you're trying to When it comes to like all this fucking about on a foam roller for half an hour, to relax the muscle and things like that. Well, actually, is that the complete antithesis of what you are trying to achieve? Now, I'm just putting this out here as a bit of a theory, is that, if the goal is in a resistance training session is to create tension, on the muscles around a joint and things like that, to maintain that tension, to put that muscle through fucking agony for an entire set. That's the goal, right? Now, if we're rolling about on a fucking foam roller and, I don't know, doing whatever the fuck people do on foam rollers, is that creating that relaxation of that muscle actually the opposite of what you're trying to achieve? And really, if you haven't been working on your mobility outside of that training session, what the fucking point is that, that little bit of time you're working on your mobility there really going to do? And how is that really going to translate in terms of actually lifting heavier or doing more output when it comes to lifting those weights and building muscle? Arguably not a fucking lot, and probably actually going to have the reverse effect. So the conclusion on this one is that it's not black and white. It's not a case that flexibility should be cast aside and never be thought about. It comes down to what is your goal and what are you trying to get out of your training. If flexibility, having more range of motion, is something that would benefit you in your circumstance, then absolutely build some flexibility and mobility work into your particular training program over the course of a week. Maybe you do that on rest days rather than straight before a training session where it could potentially impact your performance. Whereas if you have no specific goal around flexibility and your range of motion is fine for the goal that you're trying to achieve and the output that you're trying to achieve, then really you don't need to put a lot of time and effort into flexibility. It comes back down to what are you trying to achieve and what's the best way for you to achieve it. So yes, you'll see some people on the gram really all about the flexibility, and that's great. And you'll see some people on the gram that are really like, I don't do any fucking flexibility work at all, any stretching, whatever, it's shit, man. And that's great. But you've got to then sort of sit back and think about, okay, well, which of these people are giving out information that aligns with my goal? So if the flexibility person is giving you information all about stretching and things like that, and that's something that is a crucial part of your goal, well, maybe you should start listening to what that person is saying about that specific topic. If the person who's saying, well, I don't know any flexibility. Okay, well, if that isn't part of your goal either, then fine, take that piece of advice. I think you've got to start to unpick what people put out on Instagram and other forms of social media, because you can only give a finite amount of information in short bite-sized chunks. Rarely can you go into a lot of detail. Like, for example, I'm going into a little bit of detail on this podcast, which is much more than you would get on any social media post, giving you context, giving you things to think about. You can't go into this level of detail, arguably, on a 60-second social media post or something that's got 2,200 characters. So think about not just this piece of information, that sounds cool, she looks good, he looks good, I'm going to do that. Does this align to my goal? Does this serve the purpose? Does this serve me? Does this deliver the results that I want them to deliver? If it does, great, do it, build it in, but don't necessarily just take everything on face value to say, well, okay, I'm just going to follow this person blindly and whatever they do is what I'm going to do. That's probably not the way to look at it. So hopefully this episode on stretching gave you some things to think about and kind of gave you some things you can maybe go and explore when it comes to your own training and think about and basically take you up to the next level. So hopefully you got all of that out of it. Now, if you did enjoy it, again, like I said before, rating and review on iTunes, wherever you listen to podcasts, would be absolutely awesome. I really want to grow the reach of the podcast, bring on some cool guests for you. And let's face it, those cool guests are really driven by numbers. So the higher up the chart you are, the more people you get to listen. That's what attracts them. It's the way, the world we live in. So the more ratings and reviews you get, then the more people we get for you to listen to onto the show. You can also leave a donation to the podcast as well, where you can ask a question at the same time. So if you've got a burning question you want to ask, and you want to ask it with a bit of context, and you want me to answer it on an episode of the podcast with a bit more detail than I could ever give you on social media, then you can make a donation to the podcast. In the note, you can write your question and I will answer it on a future episode of the show. And thank you to everyone who's done that so far, because this certainly helps keep the lights on, literally, when it comes to making this podcast. And in terms of where we want to take the podcast, we want to take it to places where no fitness podcast has been before, and we want to do that ad-free. So that's how those donations help. And for me to give back to you, then I'll answer your specific questions in a bit more detail on the show. And of course, you can come and visit me on Instagram at iron_paradise_fitness, and you can say hi, tell me what you think of the podcast, all that sort of good stuff. Always glad to hear from you. And obviously, if you want to screenshot me, put you in your stories, love that too as well. But for now, all I'm going to say is thanks so much for watching. Thanks so much for listening. Keep living the lean life, and I'll see you for the next episode of the show.